Ukraine claims it has destroyed some 20 Russian tanks repelling an armoured assault, but Russian forces have advanced on 3 fronts and appear to have used a North Korean rocket launcher for the first time in the war. We're in Kharkiv again. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. We start today with news from Ukraine that they have repelled 2 waves of Russian armoured assaults near Kharkiv, which is in the southeastern front line in the Donetsk sector to the west of Donetsk city. Now, Ukraine said that Russia launched a series of attacks, the first one involving 11 tanks, 45 armoured vehicles, and interestingly, 12 motorcycle outriders, sort of fast soldiers, trying to get through the front lines quickly. They claimed in that first wave that Ukraine destroyed 6 tanks, 7 armoured fighting vehicles and all 12 motorcycles. And then Russia appears to have had a second attempt, this time with 10 tanks, 47 armoured vehicles and a number of buggies and motorbikes. This time Ukraine saying it destroyed 8 of those tanks and about a dozen armoured and infantry fighting vehicles, more motorbikes and 1 buggy. In the first attack, Ukraine claimed it killed about 40 Russian soldiers and a similar number were wounded. In the second attack, slightly fewer killed. Ukraine said 36 Russians killed, 32 wounded. Now, of course, all of that information coming from Ukraine's armed forces, impossible for us to sort of independently verify. One of the things that is interesting is their suggestion that sort of almost a 1-to-1 ratio of dead to wounded. Also a suggestion that Russia appears to have just repeated a failed attack a second time without any particular obvious change of tactics or softening up or preparation for that assault, and in both cases they have failed. But it comes after confirmed Russian advances on 3 fronts: in the northeast, in Kharkiv, in sort of east and central direction around Avdiivka, and in the southeastern direction near Donetsk city. It appears that Russian forces have moved west from, we know that they've moved into Marinka, which was a suburb of Donetsk city, and they appear to be advancing towards Kharkiv, which is a town. It's a town I visited early on in the war when we documented the use of Russian cluster munitions, killing and wounding a number of civilians in that town early on in the conflict. There's also today reports that Russia has used a Bullseye 4 North Korean multiple launch rocket system, a self-propelled rocket launcher or missile launcher which fires anti-tank guided munitions. These are known as NLOS ATGMs, non-line of sight anti-tank guided munitions, which have a range of about 25 kilometers. And the suggestion from open source analysis is that this launcher was in Belgorod, that's Russian soil, just north of the Kharkiv frontier, and they fired a missile into Ukraine, hitting an AS-90 self-propelled howitzer. Now, the United Kingdom is the only country which has provided, as far as we know, those AS-90 howitzers. They fire 155 millimeter artillery shells. They look like giant tanks. They're big guns on a sort of tracked chassis. They also have a very similar range of about 25 kilometers, but it would seem on this occasion, if that reporting is correct, the North Korean launcher discovered the AS-90 first and fired first and may have destroyed it. This may be a sign of what's to come. We know that countries have provided similar sorts of capabilities to Ukraine. The United Kingdom has sent Brimstone missiles, anti-tank Brimstone missiles mounted on wheeled vehicles, part of a sort of modified jerry-rigged weapon system, if you like, developed for this conflict in Ukraine. So Ukraine has a similar capability. North Korea, after Vladimir Putin's visit to Pyongyang, appears to be answering Moscow's call for weapons. We know they've given huge quantities of dumb, unguided ammunition shells. They've promised to send combat engineers to support Russian efforts in the Donbass. Now we're seeing the use of this new rocket launcher. Unclear yet whether or not that will make any significant difference on the battlefield, but worth watching. And we've also seen this week Russia has unveiled footage of a new type of drone, a drone called the Gerber drone. It looks very similar in shape to the Iranian-made Shaheds, a delta wing with a central fuselage. Suggestions from Ukraine, which has shot one of them down, that it has large parts of the fuselage and wings are made of wood to try and reduce its radar signature. And it's also worth noting that it's painted black. That's an evolution that we've seen over the course of this war. The drones, when they were first deployed, tended to be white. Now they're painted black, and that's quite simply because when they're used at night, it makes it harder for the anti-aircraft gunners to find them with their searchlights. I mean, that is a tactic, a technique reminiscent of World War II. These drones are quite noisy. Gunners search for them in the sky with their lights, and if they're white, obviously that makes them easier to detect. Also worth noting that reports have emerged in the last week of one of the ingenious ways Ukraine is detecting and tracking these drone attacks, and that is with a network of more than 9,500 acoustic sensors. Now, this is something I'd like to come back to at a later date and do a little bit more on. But apparently a very low-cost system, costing less than $5 million across the entire country, and developed initially by engineers using mobile phones, networked mobile phones, the microphones on mobile phones, to detect these sounds and then triangulate them based on an array and coordinating the information that all these phones were getting to work out, so geolocate the location and the path of these drones. Now, interestingly, again, that is a technique that was used during World War II, sort of acoustic location mechanisms, but clearly more sophisticated now, and the array of sensors available to Ukraine with technology that comes from mobile phones has made it significantly more accurate. In terms of weapons and technology on the battlefield while we're there, we'll also mention there is circulating footage of what is an F-16 and suggestions that it might be the first footage of an American-made F-16 in Ukraine. It's a piece of what looks like phone footage of a fighter jet flying through a blue sky. Any geolocating information on the horizon has been deliberately blurred. So whilst a number of people have come out and said, yes, that's definitely an F-16, the fact is we cannot be sure where it is. It might be the first sighting of an F-16 in Ukraine. We know they're due there imminently, if they're not already there, but certainly at this stage it's not clear enough for us to be confident that it's there. And worth noting, there is also a report in the Stars and Stripes news outlet, which serves the American military, saying that F-16s are due to arrive within weeks. And interestingly, they make a point, which we've made on this show repeatedly, that the F-16s are not expected to be a game changer on the battlefield, partly because there won't be enough of them, partly because of the range of their munitions won't necessarily be able to hit deep behind Russian lines, and also because of Russian air defences will make it hard for these jets to penetrate Russian territory without risk being shot down. And what that means, and this is what's interesting in Stars and Stripes, they say we should expect those F-16s to be used in an air defence role. So actually they'll be scrambled to shoot down Russian missiles, Russian drones, and to target Russian fighter jets and aircraft. In terms of what's been happening on the battlefield, in the deep battlefield, Ukraine continues its campaign against oil refineries and significantly now airfields deep inside Russian soil. We've seen strikes against refineries and oil depots in Oryov, Voronezh and Belgorod. And before that, but during this week, we've also seen drone strikes against the Engels air base in Saratov Oblast and an airfield in Ryazan Oblast as well. Now, both of those targets about 300 miles from the nearest Ukrainian territory, so very deep inside Russian soil. And General Alexander Syrsky, who is the new commander-in-chief of Ukraine's armed forces, gave an interview to the Guardian newspaper in which he said that since the start of the war, Ukraine had targeted more than 200 sites of critical military infrastructure. So that's either bases, airfields, or locations like oil refineries and depots which are supporting the Russian war effort. And I can tell you that from conversations I've had with very senior military individuals, this is not simply a question of targets of opportunity, but there is a concerted design behind these attacks. There are a handful of air bases that Russia is using to attack Ukraine, and Ukraine is aware that if it can put those at risk, it may force Russia to push its aircraft further back, deeper into Russian soil. That will mean they have to carry more fuel when they take off in order to be able to reach a place where they can launch their bombs and get back safely. More fuel means fewer bombs. So effectively it would be a way of reducing Russia's strike capability if they could push those aircraft backwards. And finally today we're going to talk about what's been happening in Mali in West Africa, because it appears that a column of Vagner mercenaries have been ambushed and slaughtered by Tuareg rebels near the Mali-Algeria border. Now this is a very sort of lawless, remote part of the world in the Sahara Desert, historically very, very dangerous and largely beyond the writ of the governments either in Bamako or in Algiers or in the region around. Now, the rebel group, the Permanent Strategic Framework for Peace, Security and Development, quite a mouthful, appears to have ambushed a column of Russian and Malian fighters, killing, we understand, some 33 Russians, at least 18 of them wounded and more taken hostage. And just today, a photograph has emerged of that rebel group brandishing a Ukrainian flag, suggesting perhaps they were aided by Ukraine, or certainly that they are supporting Ukraine against Russia. Moscow's response to this has been unclear, of course, because the relationship between Wagner and Moscow is murky ever since the mercenary group's late leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, led an attempted coup, a failed coup against Vladimir Putin. As ever, if you've got any questions, please do ask them in the comments below. I'll try and answer some of them online in the comments and also answer as many as we can here on the next update. I'm going to focus, there were two themes that came through really loud and clear from last week's show, and that was about the numbers. You remember our update last week was that prediction that if Russia continues advancing at the current rate, it could lose up to 2 million soldiers, close to 2 million soldiers, and take 5 years to capture 4 oblasts, the 4 oblasts which are Vladimir Putin's minimum requirements: Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk and Luhansk. A lot of you just asking how was that number calculated, and forgive me for not making it clear. How long it is, the first part of that equation is how long is it going to take Russia to advance? And that is time is distance over speed. So you look at how the rate of Russian advance, how far is left to go, and in order to capture that amount of territory, the assessment of the new head of the British military was it would take 5 years. Then you look at what Russia has lost since the start of the war. The war has been going on about 2.5 years, and the Western estimates of Russian losses, dead, wounded and deserted, are about 550,000. Now, if you multiply that figure, 2.5 years, by 2 to take you up to another 5 years, that will give you at least another million. So you add that million to the 550,000 already lost. Sorry, give you 1.1 million. Add that to the 5.5 that have already been killed. That gives you a figure of around 1.65. These are estimates, and the suggestion is, if you take the higher end of that estimate, what we heard from General Siroli Walker was that the Russian losses would be the best part of 1.5 to 1.8. So in summary, rate of Russian advance, how far they have left to go. If it takes them 5 years and they continue to lose soldiers at the current rate, then his estimate was 1.5 to 1.8 million soldiers. These are massive numbers, huge losses. Russia may be able to soak them up. And one of you pointed out, remember that these are human beings. We do not forget that. Both sides are suffering enormous losses. And I think I made the point last time, this really illustrates the carnage and the madness of state-on-state conflict. And on that same vein, a number of you asked, can Ukraine sustain these losses? It's a really good question. General Rowley Walker framed it in a slightly different way when he made these predictions. He said the key question is whether Ukraine can maintain its defence at the same rate and inflict the same losses on Russia. But it amounts to the same thing. We know Ukraine is hurting. It has lost a lot of soldiers. It needs to replenish the troops on the front line. Those that have survived the conflict or have fought in the conflict, many of them are exhausted, and there is a risk of sort of growing discord between those who are on the front line and fighting and those who are not, those who haven't mobilised. And so far, whilst Ukraine is changing the law to allow it to mobilise, it has not initiated a wave of mobilisation of 18 to 25-year-olds, which many feel is essential to bolster its armed forces and keep them in the fight. What we have seen, curiously, is Ukraine allowing prisoners to go on the front line. Now, this is something Russia did much earlier in the conflict, causing consternation and some condemnation around the world. But desperate times have led to desperate measures for both sides. If you have any questions, please do ask them in the comments below, and I will do my best to answer as many as I can next week.